Well, I see that you had the choice between hearing about Milton Friedman and hearing about anarchy, and you chose Milton Friedman. Now, Mises says there's no such thing as an irrational choice. I think we may have a counterexample here. But, nevertheless, we'll go with it. All right, so I'm going to talk about the two of the main methodological differences between Mises and the Austrian tradition, broadly speaking, on the one hand, and Milton Friedman on the other. I think that there's an interesting connection between these two disagreements, but what that connection is will become clearer as we go along. All right, so first of all, there's a famous quotation. Friedman has said it a number of different times in somewhat different wording, and you may have come across it in some form or other, where Friedman says there's a problem with the a priori method that Mises favors. Mises and Rothbard, and as far as Friedman is concerned, Hayek. There's a dispute about how much of an a priorist Hayek was, and whether the degree to which he was one changed over the course of his career. But as far as Friedman was concerned, Hayek was always a wild, crazy a priorist. And Friedman's argument is that if you have this a priori approach, then you have no means of settling disagreements. Friedman described himself as a Popperian, although I don't think his views are precisely the same as Popper's on this stuff. But here's at least one version of the quote. If you and I are both praxeologists, and we disagree about whether some proposition or statement is correct, how do we resolve that disagreement? We can yell, we can argue, we can try to find a logical flaw in one another's thing. This is something he said, not something he wrote, so that's why there's this odd phrase, finding a logical flaw in one another's thing, which seems to be, the equivalent of yelling, I guess. But in the end, we have no way to resolve it except by fighting, by saying you're wrong and I'm right. On the other hand, if you take more like a Karl Popperian approach, I say to you, what facts can I find that will convince you I was right and you were wrong? Then we go out and observe the facts. That's how science progresses. So, the way that Friedman is seeing it, if you have an empirical method, then there's a basis for resolving disputes. Because there's a public world out there, you can observe it with your senses, I can observe it with mine. We can go out and look at the empirical reality, and that will help us resolve it. Whereas, if you're following an a priori method, then as Friedman sees it, I'm just, turning my eyes inward and consulting my own intuition. You're turning your eyes inward and consulting your intuition. My intuition says one thing, your intuition says another, and there's no basis for us to agree, and so then we have to fight. And in fact, there are some versions of this quote where he says, we have to fight literally in the sense of resorting to violence, which doesn't seem like an obvious inference. But you might think it's a bit puzzling because, when he talks about the various things you could do, like yelling, he mentions trying to find a logical flaw in one another's thing. Which seems like the kind of thing that you might try to do if you had a disagreement with someone that was conceptual rather than empirical. All right, so you wouldn't go and try and find the empirical evidence that would settle it. But you could try and you could try to convince them that they've made a mistake in reasoning. They could try to convince you that you've made a mistake in reasoning. And isn't that in fact what happens in conceptual disagreements? When Austrians disagree with each other, they don't resort to fist fights usually. Usually they write articles. And sometimes they convince each other, and sometimes they don't. Likewise, mathematicians. When mathematicians disagree with each other, they don't resort to fisticuffs. They go through their reasoning and try to convince the other person they're wrong. So what's going on here? Well, I think that Friedman is thinking of a priorism as a matter of consulting some inner private voice. It's a matter of consulting something private. So he thinks of empiricism as a matter of consulting something public, something that's publicly available. You and I can both go out and use our senses and perceive the same stuff. But he thinks that in the case of a priori reasoning, you're consulting something private. I'm turning my mind inward to gaze at my own, the contents of my own thoughts, and you're turning your gaze inward to perceive your own thoughts, and there's no basis for a meeting of the minds. But is that really the right way to think about, what's going on when you're having a logical or a conceptual disagreement with someone. In the case of mathematics, when you and I are both reasoning about whether 2 plus 2 equals 4 or something, loftier and more complicated in mathematics, are we each just sort of consulting some inner private voice? It seems as though certainly there's a sense in which mathematics is just as public as empirical science. Whatever you think the status of mathematical truth is, whether you think that there really are these mathematical entities in the Platonic heaven, or if you believe that somehow they're constructs of human thought or practice, whatever it is you think about the nature of mathematical objects, we don't think that there's something that's private to each of us. We think that, when I'm thinking about the number 2, and you're thinking about the number 2, we can both think about the same number 2. I'm sure David is thinking of something silly about number 2 now. But the same number that's the object of my thought is the object of your thought. It isn't that I've got my own 2 in my head and you've got your 2 in yours, and I can only know my 2 and I can't know yours. Whatever you think the nature of the number 2 is, it's something that's accessible to both of us. It's a shareable good, as it were. Well, there's a German logician who I'll be talking about more tomorrow, Gottlob Frege, who distinguished what he called 3 realms. First, there's the outer realm, which is basically the realm of ordinary physical objects. And his way of describing it, these were things that were perceivable by the senses, and public. Public in the sense that they're just as they're just as available to me as to you. Then there's stuff in the inner realm, which is basically my or your internal thoughts and feelings, and these are things that are not perceivable by the senses. I can't just look at you and see your thoughts. Actually, there's a sense in which I can, but never mind, because that would take us to a different lecture. And they're not public. Again, there's a sense in which they are, but never mind. So if you're looking at this blackboard and I'm looking at this blackboard, we're both seeing the same thing. But when you're having, some sort of personal feeling inside, you've got some kind of twitch, or you've got a stomach ache. I can't directly perceive your stomach ache. It's not perceivable by the senses. It's not public. But, said Frege, this doesn't exhaust the options. There's also something he called the third realm, and perhaps embarrassingly, the German phrase he used is also the one we would translate as Third Reich. Though at the time that he wrote this, the Third Reich didn't have quite the connotation or flavor that it does now. The third realm is the realm of things that are not perceivable by the senses, yet they are public. And here he had in mind the constructs of logic and mathematics. So when you're thinking that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and I'm thinking that 2 plus 2 equals 4, although my personal mental state belongs to my inner realm, and your personal mental state belongs to your inner realm, the content of it, that fact that we're both thinking 2 plus 2 equals 4, that exists in the third realm. Now, of course, it's a separate philosophical question what the metaphysical status of the third realm is. Do these things really exist on their own as something like Platonic forms? Or are they somehow constructed by human thought and action? Well, that's an interesting question, but you don't need to settle that question to see that you can make these distinctions even if you disagree about, just like you can distinguish between the inner realm and the outer realm regardless of whether you're a dualist or a materialist about the mind. What you think the relationship among these is, whether you think some of these are autonomous or whether they're constructed out of the other ones, that's a different question. Now, for those of you who know anything about Popper, they recognize that Popper also has a 3-world or 3-realm distinction. It's not quite the same. In particular, the third one is not quite the same as what Popper calls World 3. Or in his early writings, he called the third world, just to imitate Frege and using a term that would turn out to have some unintended political implication, but later on he changed it to World 3. Anyway, what Frege means by the third realm is not what Popper means by World 3. This isn't a lecture on Popper, so never mind what Popper means by World 3. It's an interesting question what the relation is between Popper's World 3 and Frege's third realm, but it's not a question for this lecture. So, I think that when Friedman is thinking of a priorism as a matter of turning to things in the inner realm, rather than going to the publicly available outer realm of stuff we can perceive by the senses, he thinks that Mises is trying to get us to turn our minds inward and look at sort of our own internal, mental stuff going on. And somehow I look at my mental stuff and you look at your mental stuff, and because I can't perceive yours and you can't perceive mine, there's no basis for an agreement. Whereas I think it's better understood to say that what Mises wants to turn our minds to is something that Frege would describe as a third realm item. Whatever the status of that is, it's not the mental state itself, it's the content of the mental state. And your mental state and my mental state can have the same content if we're thinking the same proposition, even if we're doing it in two different minds. And I think what's related to this is when Austrians talk, as they sometimes do, about certain propositions like axioms being self-evident. I think that Friedman thinks of self-evidence in a psychological way. Self-evidence means a subjective feeling of certainty you have. You think about a certain proposition, and you just feel a warm glow of, gosh, that's got to be right about it. And of course, if I've got that warm glow at the proposition, and you don't have an analogous warm glow when you analyze that proposition, well then, again, there's no basis for agreement. I just report this subjective feeling of certainty. You report an absence of any such thing. And, if that's what self-evidence were, if we're simply a psychological matter, then Friedman would be right. That would be no basis for doing science. But that's not what self-evidence means in the way that Austrians use it. To say something is self-evident isn't to say something psychological about how it is that we feel when we confront such a proposition. Is to say that a self-evident proposition is a proposition that doesn't need any evidence beyond itself to be justified. It's a logical point. It's a point that, take something like the action axiom. What makes the action axiom self-evident is not that you get, a warm glow of certainty when you think about the proposition that there's such a thing as human action. Maybe you do get such a glow, and if so, fine, you're right. But it's because you can't, take the action of denying it without thereby logically contradicting your own denial of it. And whether something is logically contradictory or not is not a matter of sort of subjective mental glows. It's a matter of, it's like logic or mathematics. It's something you can assess publicly. So that's the so much for now for the first point about Friedman's disagreement with Mises. Though at the end I want to come back to it because I think that the second disagreement I'm about to talk about actually has the same root as the first one. Okay, so what's the second disagreement? Well, Friedman wrote a famous article called The Methodology of Positive Economics. It came out in 1953. It's the lead essay in his book titled Essays in Positive Economics. And Hayek once said that there were two works that he wished he had attacked when they came out, and he didn't because he was allies with the authors on various things. One was Keynes's general theory, which he didn't attack. Partly didn't attack it because he thought Keynes is always changing his mind. It's not worthwhile to attack something he's probably going to retract in a year. But the other reason is that he and Keynes actually agreed, at least at that time. I don't know how principled Keynes's opposition to inflation was, but at that time they both agreed that inflation was a problem. And so Hayek and Keynes were working together arguing against inflation. And so Hayek said, I don't want to attack Keynes right now because we're allied on this question. He said he later regretted that. The other one was Friedman. Hayek and Friedman were allied, politically on a number of issues. And so he didn't attack Friedman's essay when it came out. But Hayek said he thought that essay was as dangerous in its way as the general theory. Well, one of the things that's going on in that essay is that Friedman is attacking the idea that assumptions in economics should be realistic. So this is a disagreement you sometimes see between Austrian and mainstream economists. Austrians often attack mainstream economists for having assumptions like perfect competition or perfect information because they think that these things explain away or assume away the very things that the Austrians want to appeal to as what's doing the explaining. If you think that it's the fact that people have imperfect information and make different predictions, and then in the process of acting on them, some turn out to be right and some turn out to be wrong, and they get positive or negative feedback, and that leads them then to make different decisions. If you think that's crucial to explaining how the market works, then assuming right off, from the bat that all market participants have perfect information is going to be assuming away the very thing that you think matters. Likewise, if you take an assumption according to which all information that's available gets transmitted instantaneously throughout the economy, it doesn't take any time, or if you assume that, let's say, an increase in the money supply instantly produces, increased price levels uniformly across the economy, then a lot of things that Austrians want to explain, you wouldn't be able to explain, like Cantillon effects or the ways in which inflationary policies systematically benefit some people at the expense of others, which you couldn't explain if you thought that, everyone's money loses the same percentage of value simultaneously. Now, it's not that Austrians never use unrealistic models. But when they use them, they don't use them to represent the economy. Take, for example, the evenly rotating economy, which is certainly an unrealistic model. But its purpose is not to represent the real economy. The function of the evenly rotating economy is not to say, look, here's what happens in the evenly rotating economy, so we can predict that this is what will happen in the real world. Quite the contrary. Part of the point of the evenly rotating economy is to contrast it with the real world. Now, it's an unrealistic model. It's useful because it helps us, for example, draw the distinction between profit and interest. Because you imagine a situation in which, people lack the kind of uncertainty about the future that makes profit possible. But nevertheless, they retain the preference for present satisfactions over future ones that makes interest possible. And so by thinking about the evenly rotating economy, you can see, for example, that there wouldn't be profit in that context, but there would be interest, and so that can help you see what the difference is between interest and profit, which is a tricky distinction to get because, they're both cases where you get more back than you put in, and it can be tricky to figure out what the difference is, and the ERE can help explain that. So it's not that Austrians are against unrealistic models. The question is, what you're doing with them. And mainstream economists use unrealistic models as models of the real economy and use the predictions that these models generate to make predictions about the real economy. So, Austrians disagree with doing that. In particular, they think that the things that are left out tend to be the very things that are most explanatory. Anyway, so in this article, Friedman argues in defense of using unrealistic models, and here's his argument. If a model of the economy were perfectly realistic, it would have to include all the information. And so, for example, it would have to include whether the people trading in the market were left-handed or right-handed, or how many freckles they had, or what color shoes they had, or whether they were descended from Lithuanians and so forth. You'd have to include all that. And of course, that's impossible. It would be too unwieldy to have, it would be impossible to have a model of the economy that really included all information about market participants. So, says Friedman, obviously you have to simplify. You have to omit lots and lots of information. And so, of course you're going to end up with a simplified, stylized model that doesn't match reality. But that's because a model that really matches reality, it's like saying you complain about the map because, the map is more simple than reality. Well, if you wanted a map that's just like reality, it would have to be as big as the real world, and it would have to be in 3D, and it would have to have everything, a map of Auburn, Alabama would have to include this electric cord being right there where it is, and so on. You just have to create a whole second planet, exactly like an exact duplicate of the first one. So the whole point of models is to simplify. And to simplify, they have to then not be completely realistic. They have to be somewhat inaccurate. They have to portray a simpler world than the real one. And I've got a quote from the first quote from Friedman here under part 2. I won't read it, but it basically says, what I just said Friedman said. Yeah.
Doesn't that...
Well, he's going to say that the way we find out which ones are the important ones is by doing empirical testing. Well, or you could, as it happens, we've already had enough history to tell that we know what kinds of things tend to work and what kind don't. Yeah. Well, I think that's right, but I think there's a worse problem with what he's saying. I don't know if it's a worse problem. Anyway, here's a problem with what he's saying, that, I think is important. I think he's confusing the idea of a description that omits some information in the sense of failing to mention it, with a description that omits some information in the sense of specifying it's not present. Suppose that you were to describe me, and you describe me as, a fat bearded guy up in front of the room who keeps talking and stuff, but you didn't mention my clothes. You didn't mention what clothes I was wearing. You didn't even mention that I had any on. You just described me as this fat bearded guy who kept talking about economics up the front of the room. Compare that with a description of me that says, he was this fat bearded guy with no clothes on, which would be a much less lovely prospect. But in both descriptions omit my clothes. But they don't omit my clothes in the same way. One of them omitted my clothes simply in failing to specify that I had any. But the other one omitted my clothes by actually specifying I didn't have any. Now, the second one was unrealistic. In the sense it contradicted the facts. But the first one wasn't unrealistic. If you simply describe things about me and you failed to mention my clothes, there's nothing unrealistic about it. It's not inaccurate at all. It's perfectly accurate. Everything it said was true. It just didn't say everything that could conceivably be said. Now, there's this dispute, I think that Friedman is confusing the idea that sort of any abstract consideration of something has to leave out some of the information with the idea that it has to be, therefore, a simplified picture in the sense of picturing a more simplified world than the real one. Now, of course, any description is simplified in the sense that it specifies less than everything that's true. But it's different from it's describing a simpler world. A description of me that leaves out any reference to my clothes is not a description of naked me. And so likewise, a description of the economy that leaves out, whether the traders are left or right-handed or how many freckles they have and so forth, that description is not describing a simpler world, a world without freckles or without handedness. Now, Mises had a similar dispute with his own teacher, Eugen von Baabeck, when Mises was working on monetary theory and Cantillon effects. Well, sometimes it's called Cantillon, sometimes Cantillon, depending on whether you pronounce it the English or the French way. And this guy was a guy who, yeah, well, he was a French/Irish guy. So maybe you should pronounce it with an Irish accent. I'm not sure I can do it, but Cantillon. Anyway, a Cantillon effect is one where the way in which the new money gets propagated through the economy makes a difference. So that when new money is injected into the economy, it's not injected simultaneously into everyone's pockets all at once. That would be pointless. There's not much rent-seeking opportunity there. Instead, money is injected into the pockets of the favored first, and therefore they face the old prices having the new money, and then it gradually spreads to the economy until finally get the people get systematically shafted who start facing the new higher prices before they get the new money. There'd be no point in having inflation if it sort of affected everyone equally. Anyway, so in the work that Mises was doing on the way to building up his theory of money and credit, the uneven effects of monetary distribution throughout the economy play a crucial role in his theory. Baabeck didn't want to place such emphasis on these. Baabeck said, it's like a friction effect. He says, just as in physics, when you describe the way things move, you generally leave out friction because most of the time friction doesn't make that much of a difference. You just treat objects as if they're sort of moving through vacuum. And the best physical theory is one that sort of just describes the pure idealized movement of these things. Now, whether that's the right thing to say about physics or not is an interesting question, but again, let's leave it aside. Mises' reaction was, well, whether or not that's the right thing to say about physics, he didn't think it was the right thing to say about economics. I'm inclined to think it's not quite right to say about physics either, but anyway, he thought that the so-called friction phenomenon of, who gets the money first was crucial in explaining things, and so he argued against Baabeck, who wanted to distinguish between, the economic story and the real story. And in fact, you can find some of the early pre-Misesian Austrians who will draw this distinction between economic prices and real prices, which is odd for a realist theory. But they hadn't. And from Mises' point of view, the early Austrians hadn't completely freed themselves from this. This feature of classical economics, where it was often thought that you sometimes find the classical economists saying, we're studying the behavior of the businessman. And the businessmen are profit seekers. We know that people in their real lives aren't always seeking profit, monetary profit. They're often doing other things. We're just ignoring that and focusing on businessman qua businessman. And Mises was opposed to that. He was opposed to it in the classicals, and he was opposed to that in the remnants of that in the early Austrians. He said, no, we're not talking about some idealized, non-actual businessman who always pursues monetary profit. We're talking about real people insofar as they pursue the various things they pursue, sometimes monetary profit and sometimes something else. So there's a sense in which, Böhm-Bawerk was not as extreme as Friedman on this. One difference, I think, between them is that Böhm-Bawerk thought that the frictionless model was at least an approximation to the real model. To the reality. Whereas Friedman doesn't think that that unrealistic hypotheses have to even be approximations. From Friedman's point of view, all that matters is how well they predict. And so if you've got a theory that you recognize is not even approximate to reality, it's wildly inaccurate, but he says, well, look, if it has a good empirical track record, if it's good at predicting stuff, that's fine, that's all you need. Whereas I think from a Misesian standpoint, the worry would be, look, even if it's a good predictor in the short run, you'll have no idea how good a predictor it's likely to be in the long run, so long as you don't understand what the real mechanism is. For example, suppose that I form this hypothesis that there is a constant force in the universe that produces a Harry Potter movie every few years. It's just a basic physical force in the universe. Its function is to produce Harry Potter movies that, I can calculate. I'm not sure exactly what the frequency is, but I can calculate sort of roughly what it is. And it might be, suppose I formulated this, quite a few years ago, it would turn out to be a fairly good predictor, because the Harry Potter movies would keep coming, and I would say, and people would say, yeah, but you don't really think that there's some basic physical force in the universe that does this, and you'd want to tell me some story about human beings doing stuff, and I'd say, well, yeah, I know this isn't strictly accurate, but, in fact, I know it's not even approximately accurate, but it's an awfully good predictor. Well, yeah, but unless I understand the real story as to why these things keep getting produced, I'm going to be surprised when the prediction fails. Because after two more movies, since they're planning to split the last book into two movies, after two more movies, it will stop, presumably. At least that's the most likely prediction, given the actual story of the fact that there's a book there's a book series that's 7 books long, and they're just doing those books, and then she hasn't given permission to do, any more Harry Potter movies after that, and so, of course, in a world without IP, there probably would continue to be Harry Potter movies. But assuming that IP is not going to go away anytime soon, knowing the actual stuff that's going on, I can predict that this short-run correlation is not going to last for the long run. But if you don't know why the correlation is there, the mere fact that something is, that a prediction works in the short run, if you don't know why it's happening, you're not going to be able to predict how long it will last. Now, on this whole thing about abstraction, and about the difference between abstractions that omit features of reality in the sense of actually specifying that they're not there, versus abstractions that simply fail to specify whether something's there or not. For those of you familiar with Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, you may think that this sounds familiar, since Rand made precisely this distinction. Actually, this is a distinction that gets made throughout the Aristotelian tradition. Now, I don't know, how familiar she was with that tradition, so I don't know to what extent she developed this idea on her own and to what extent she got it from the tradition. But if you look through the tradition, the Aristotelians were very concerned to defend the idea that abstractions don't falsify. Abstractions are not inaccurate. Whereas if you think of abstractions as sort of stylized or simplified versions of reality, you're going to worry that they're not accurate. Or else you're going to fall into sort of the Platonic way of thinking of, well, they're not accurate about the physical world, so they must be accurate about some other world. So the concept of a horse doesn't specify any particular color. So, since real horses all have color, but the ideal horse I'm thinking of doesn't have any color, therefore, if it's going to be accurate, it must refer to some colorless horse that doesn't exist in the physical realm. And so, therefore, our concept's either about some superphysical realm, or they're about nothing. And the Aristotelians wanted to say, no, you have to distinguish between precisive abstractions, which are ones that specify the absence of certain features. So if I formed the concept of a headless horse, a horse that's sort of naturally without a head, I would be sort of specifying the absence of something that's really present, and then I'd be inventing something that wasn't true to reality. But if I'm simply thinking of a horse without thinking about its head, then that would be a non-precisive abstraction. I just simply don't specify whether there's a head or not. And non-precisive abstractions, although they're not fully, they don't describe everything there's to describe about reality, they don't falsify. They're fully accurate. They're fully realistic. And you find the basic roots of this idea in Aristotle, where, unlike Plato, who thought that mathematics was about a different realm, a different kind of objects from physical objects, Aristotle thought that mathematics and physics were about the same object, but considered them differently. Mathematics and geometry simply consider objects as having quantity and length and breadth and depth and so forth, and abstracts from their particular physical constitution and their causal relations and so on, whereas physics takes those further things into consideration. In fact, running throughout the Aristotelian tradition, you find this idea, regardless of whether the particular Aristotelians were realists or nominalists about universals. Realists about universals are people who think that things like abstract chairness and tableness and so forth really exist out there in reality, whereas nominalists think that those are constructed by human thought and language. If you look at sort of the so-called realists and so-called nominalists of the medieval Aristotelian tradition, people like Aquinas, who was a realist, or Abelard, who was a nominalist, in fact, the divide between them is not as big as that might make it sound. Abelard, for example, says that universals don't exist in reality. They're the products of our thought and language, but they're based on similarities that exist in reality external to our minds. Aquinas, by contrast, says that universals exist out there in reality, but not as universal. Universals exist outside as particularized. It's only in our minds that they exist as universal. So this big contrast between the realists and the nominalists, I don't mean that they're not disagreeing about anything. I think there are some genuine theoretical disagreements between them, but it's not quite as deep an abyss as it might sound. In any case, the Abelard and Aquinas both make this distinction between abstractions that specify that something that's present in the real world isn't present, and those abstractions then falsify, or at least they're not true to the things that they're based on. You could use an abstraction like that to invent something new, but it's not an accurate depiction of reality as it is. Whereas non-precise abstractions leave information out, simply in the sense of not specifying what it is, and then those abstractions don't falsify. So this is a common theme you find, and you find it in someone like Franz Brentano, who was an Austrian philosopher who made this point. And you find a very similar point being made by Mises. Again, I don't know how far Mises might have known about Brentano on this, I don't know, or he might have come up with it independently. But Mises has this argument with Max Weber and Alfred Schutz about whether praxeological concepts are ideal types. Now, the term ideal type is used in more than one way, but at least as Mises was understanding it, an ideal type was, something like a precisive abstraction. Like the businessman is someone who's devoted solely to the pursuit of monetary profit and never does anything for any other purpose. Sort of a stylized or one-sided intensification of reality. And Mises says, no. Praxeological concepts are not simplifications or stylizations of reality. They're not, what the Aristotelian tradition would call precisive abstractions. They apply to reality. Now, remember I said that I thought that this disagreement that Friedman has might be related to the other disagreement Friedman has with Mises. Here's why I think so. I think the confusion between the inner realm and the third realm, between sort of, subjective thoughts and logical content, the distinction between sort of the mental act of thinking, which just exists in your mind, and the content of what you're thinking, which is something in the third realm, I think that distinction between the act and the content of thinking also helps people to have trouble distinguishing between precisive and non-precisive abstraction. Because, of course, when I think about actors in the economy, without thinking about how many freckles they have or whether they're left or right-handed, then, their freckledness and handedness are absent from my act of thinking. And so therefore, you might think that therefore I must be thinking about non-handed, non-freckled people. But and since real people have some handedness and they either have or don't have freckles and so forth, then I must be thinking about some non-real things. But again, that's confusing the act of thinking with the content. The act of my thinking is something here in the inner realm. But just as you and I can have, different mental acts, yet they can have the same content, so, two different acts of mine, one that takes freckledness into account and one that doesn't, can both be about the same economic realities, even though one includes stuff and one doesn't. So I think that psychologism, which is something I'll be talking about tomorrow, psychologism is the tendency to confuse logical categories with psychological ones, or to mistake logical categories for psychological ones. Sorry, if you try to write the word psychologism while saying the word psychological, bad things will happen. For example, I just caused a typhoon in Bangladesh. So I think that Friedman's first mistake, I think, is an example of psychologism, because he thinks that appealing to logical or conceptual truths, the way praxeology does, is a matter of turning your mind inward to some psychological item, as opposed to turning to the publicly available realm of logic. But I also think that, confusing, thinking that because an act of thinking fails to specify something, therefore what that act of thinking is about, or is intended to be about, must also lack that thing, is also a version of psychologism. It is thinking that an act of thinking can't have anything in its content that isn't a feature of the act itself. Psychologism, I claim, is why Friedman has gone wrong in both of these points. No, questions? Yes.
Third realm being a...
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's special complications with Kant's use of that terminology, but Kant's borrowing it from the Platonic tradition. And the Platonists use sensible and versus intelligible realm, for something like the distinction between stuff you perceive through your senses and stuff you grasp with your minds. And Mises talks about conceiving, as it distinguishes perceiving, understanding, and conceiving. Understanding has to do with sort of, interpreting, you from the standpoint of your own values, and that, I guess that's how we access other people's inner realm. And that's why I said that there's a question as to whether it really counts as not public, but I wasn't going to talk about it. And then perceiving stuff counts as the outer realm, because when he says we need to conceive, for praxeology, we need to conceive things, he's talking about something like this third realm. So, I think that the Kant's notion of the intelligible comes from this. The difference, of course, is that Kant has a very distinctive. For Kant, the intelligible realm is not quite the same as the realm of logic. It's supposed to be, the intelligible realm is things out there that, in some sense, they're the kinds of things you could perceive if perception of them were possible, except you have to find them in such a way that they're not. So although the terminology is okay, I should have repeated the question, but maybe it's obvious from my answer what the question was. The question was, this Kant's distinction between the perceptible and intelligible realms, is that analogous to this? And my answer is in one sense yes, in another sense no, which is my answer to most things. Yes? The question is, have I seen a recent article by Gene Callahan and someone else that came out from Mercatus called The Role of Ideal Types in Austrian Business Cycle Theory? And the question is whether I've read it, and the answer is no. That was easy. Oh, what does he say?
I mean, they basically does in fact.
Okay. Because also, I mean, the phrase ideal type is used in more than one way, and so there may be some legitimate use of the term ideal type where it would be okay to describe Austrians as using it. I don't know. Yeah. So the question is a book like Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, is it simply working out with various abstractions that simply fail to specify the details? Yeah, I think that's right. Rothbard isn't trying to describe sort of some stylized model of idealized or simplified actors. He's trying to describe real actors, but he's abstracting from the particular goals and so forth that they have. Yeah.
Their criticism of their argument is that.
Yeah. So the question is, both Popper and Hayek criticize something they call psychologism, by which they mean something like the idea that social science has to be based on psychology, and they criticize it on the grounds that you can know the interactions among people without knowing what their basic psychology is motivating them. And how does that relate to Mises? Well, it relates to Mises this far. Mises would agree with that point. That's part of why he distinguishes. That's why he says all you need to know is that someone is performing a certain action. You don't need to know their deep-seated motives. However, you could be anti-psychologism in that sense without necessarily being anti-psychologism in the sense of thinking that logical or praxeological categories are somewhat independent of and prior to psychology. So I think that what Mises means might include that, but I think they're not committed to what Mises means. Yeah. So the question is, are the kind of models, stylized models you get in, for example, the Chicago School, are those something like Platonic forms? Well, I mean, I think they have the features that people who reject Platonic forms object to them for. Since I don't believe there really are any Platonic forms, I don't believe that the Chicago School has created any. So that's why the question is a little bit ambiguous. But there's an article by George Reisman called Platonic Competition, where he describes perfect competition models, as being Platonic in the sense of, creating an abstraction that doesn't apply to reality, and also Platonic in the sense of thinking that reality is imperfect for not living up to the abstraction. Of course you could do one without the other. You could have a perfect competition model that you use because you think it makes good predictions without necessarily thinking that deviations from it are a sign of some sort of problem. But of course it's true that perfect competition models often have been used, not just as an unrealistic model for getting predictions, but they've also been used as something to compare the real economy with and say, look, the fact that we don't match this perfect competition model is a problem for the real economy rather than thinking it's a problem for the model. And of course, a mismatch between the model and reality being a problem for reality rather than the model is sort of a Platonic move. Yeah.
Starting with stay out of it because starting with these aggregates that go in.
I think there's a tendency. It's not a necessary connection because I can certainly think of people who use these neoclassical models and yet who are strong, thoroughgoing libertarians. But so, there's no necessary connection that one leads to the other. But I do think that it tends to reinforce habits of thought. If you're thinking about, just these sort of mass aggregates, and you think that you can somehow, I think that acting on the mass aggregates tends to cover up what actually happens when policies are actually acting on particular people. You just think, well, you need to get this aggregate to do something, and forgetting that, particular people have to be shoved and bludgeoned and so forth in order to make it happen. Whereas when you follow a method of methodological individualism, it's easy to remember. When the state decrees, all these people should do something, a bunch of individual people have to go around and start shoving around a bunch of other individual people to make it happen. And so I think that it can just, so when you're focusing on sort of what's really happening, it's easier to it's harder to psychologically justify to yourself various kinds of state coercion, and it's easier to do it when when all the messy details on the ground are being covered up by some sort of abstraction. And in particular, when you leave out things like Cantillon effects, you leave out the very things that that cast doubt on the purity of government motives. After all, part of the point of Cantillon effects is there are motivations for government to inflate. Namely, it systematically benefits some people at the cost of others. And those people form a constituency to want more of this inflation. And so when you leave out details like that and just, treat inflation as though suddenly, money ended up simultaneously in everyone's pockets at once, then it's harder to see what's nefarious about it. So I think there is a broad connection, but, certainly there are, certainly you could hold one view without necessarily being committed to the corresponding one. The question is, can you be a materialistic determinist and be a praxeologist, or do you have to believe in some kind of free will that contradicts determinism? Well, as I read Mises, I think Mises was a determinist. I think that he perhaps moves a little too quickly from the thesis that everything has to have a cause to the thesis that everything has to be causally determined. I don't think that those are equivalent claims. But he thinks that in order to act at all, you have to assume certain kinds of causal regularities exist. Because you have to apply means to ends, and you have to think that therefore there's a necessary connection between the means and the ends in order to apply means to ends, and therefore you have to think that the world is regular and determined. Plus he seems to have thought that praxeology implied a kind of psychological determinism. I'm not sure this is the right interpretation of Mises, but as I read him, he seems to think that you always act to satisfy your highest preference. At least sometimes talks as though your highest preference is some sort of pre-existing fact about you that leads you to act in those ways. So I think that so certainly I think you can be a determinist and be a praxeologist. I don't think you have to be. I don't think those arguments of Mises' work. I think that the fact that you always act for your highest preference just means you're always acting for the highest preference at the moment, but doesn't mean that your highest preference at the moment was somehow the necessary result of whatever your highest preference was a minute ago. And in order to apply means to ends, I don't think you have to assume that the means is causally sufficient for the end. All you have to just think that the means, has a fair probability of producing the end. And that's good enough. Otherwise no one would ever play a slot machine. I don't know if that would be a particular tragedy for the world if no one did, but it would be a tragedy for certain industries. Yeah.
Logical problems with it. A problem that actually comes back to the first quote and goes out and theory of the causes of the Great Depression, his monetary theory. At the point that he's formulated and takes ownership of it, defend its possibility. You can have 5 positivists that come all with different models, and each of course you can predict things. And so he's leveling against Austrian seems to not be applicable to.
Okay, so the question is it really true that this empiricist method leads to absence of conflict and just going and humbly looking at the facts, given that once you've developed a theory that seems to be supported by the facts, you become invested in it and have a personal attachment to it, so now you want to defend it, which means that a bunch of positivists will be very well, in fact we see in reality do, end up, it's not as though empiricists never disagree or never, fight and argue or all instantly look at the same facts and become converted, yeah. There was a question way in the back there. He was Kantian in some respects and not Kantian in others, I think he thought that, and one difference between Mises and Rothbard is Mises thought, or at least he often talked, there's some dispute about how to read him here, but Mises often talked as though he thought that the source of these a priori truths is something to do with the structure of the human mind, that the human mind imposes a certain structure on our experience, so we necessarily experience things in terms of praxeological categories, and that's supposed to be analogous to the way Kant thought that the structure of the human mind imposes things like space and time and causality on our experience. Now, there's a dispute about whether that's the right way to read Kant, and there's also a dispute about whether that's the right way to read Mises. But if you think the answer to both those questions is yes, then that'll be a sense in which Mises is a Kantian, and at least that's a sense in which Rothbard thought of himself as disagreeing with Mises. Because Rothbard thought that these weren't things that were inherent in the structure of the human mind. He thought that our human mind was responsive to the structure of reality, and that There was even a very broad sense in which the praxeological truths are empirical, not in the sense of being sort of particular things that you test, but in the sense of being things that we sort of take in just as part of ordinary human experience. So Rothbard took himself to be an Aristotelian in that sense, and and different Austrians have taken different views. Barry Smith, who wrote written a book called Austrian Philosophy, which tries to place the Austrian economics in the context of various philosophical movements going on in Vienna. He's argued that there are that praxeological truths are neither perceptible features of empirical reality the way Rothbard sometimes talks, nor are they sort of structures of the mind imposed on reality the way that Mises sometimes talks, but he thinks that they're non-empirical features of reality that we grasp by kind of intuition. So there are lots of different accounts lots of different ways you can go. When you talk about grasping conceptual truths, well, lots of different theories about the nature of conceptual truths. Are they something in our minds? Are they something out there in a Platonic reality? Something in between? How do we access them? And there's room for disagreement about those things, but I think that you can be a praxeologist and hold, one or another of a variety of different views, just as you could accept something like this distinction and still, some people just like the outer realm versus the inner realm, you could be a dualist or a materialist and still think you can do something with this distinction. What the distinction comes to will be a little bit different. It'll be sort of an ultimate distinction if you're a dualist, whereas if you're a materialist, you'll think that in some sense the inner realm was constituted out of the outer. Likewise, if you're some kind of realist about universals, you might think this distinction is an ultimate one. If you're not, you might think that this one is somehow constructed out of the other two. But you don't have to take a stand on those issues, as far as I can see, in order to be a praxeologist, broadly speaking. How are we doing on time? Got time for a couple more? Yes. Well, that's partly what Mises and Rothbard were disagreeing about. Mises thought that theory is part of the structure of our minds, just built in there before we ever experience anything, whereas Rothbard thought that it was based broadly on experience at a very broad and basic level. Now, there's a famous line from Kant, where Kant distinguishes between saying that all knowledge arises out of experience and saying all knowledge arises with experience. And he thinks it's not true that all knowledge arises out of experience. He thinks that there's sort of a priori categories in the mind. But Kant also said that it's not as though you could simply, if you'd never had any sense experiences, you could just sit there and sort of reason it all out. So there'll be a contrast between a view like that, and there's the medieval Arabic philosopher Ibn Sina, something known in the West by the Latinized version of his name, Avicenna, who maintained that if you had been born in a sensory deprivation tank, he didn't use that phrase, but he described something that basically is that. You've been suspended in the air without touching anything, and your eyes are closed and so forth. You don't have you grow up without any senses, no sensory input whatever. And he thought that nevertheless, you could form the concept of being, and thereby deduce your own existence and the existence of the universe, and therefore you'd have grasped the difference between necessary and contingent being, and you could come up with the cosmological argument of the existence of God, and so forth, never having had any sensory experiences whatever. Kant rejects that view. Kant thinks that although we've got these a priori categories in our minds, in order to activate them, you need some kind of experience. It's not that we get them from the experience, but they're just without the experience, nothing's happening. It's like when you put the gas in the car, you're not putting the engine in the car. The engine's already in the car. But without gas, the engine's not going to do anything. That's one way of putting it. Whereas Ibn Sina would seem to think that once you've got the engine in the car, the engine can just go and drive off the car and not need any got. The engine somehow produces its own gas. Whereas the empiricists think that you have to put not only the gas but the engine in, and Kant thinks the engine's already there, but then you put the gas in. I'm not sure how useful an analogy that is, but yeah.
It's like a dilemma where, is there anyone that has the view that this is a real dichotomy?
I think that something like that, I think, is Kant's view. It's that one doesn't come before the other, temporally. There's no thought before experience. But nevertheless, you could still ask, what's the explanation of my having this, this conceptual category? And then an empiricist is going to say, you're getting that purely on the basis of sensory experience. And he's going to say, you need sensory, causally you need sensory experience in order to have it, but it's not derived from it. But that's a tricky distinction. Someone could question whether that distinction really holds up. But anyway, he's trying to run that distinction. Okay, I think that time has come to an end.